Okay. Nice little Saturday morning. And we got something a little bit special today. We are going to be reviewing the CR33 updates. For those who do not know or understand what that means or entails, let's go through that, because a few weeks ago, month ago, something like that, I posted that Polaris video. And within days, I had a phone call from Norman and then a discussion with Dan Cornwell after that. And part of that was they, wanted me to submit an update for the CR33s and my thoughts on how to bring us forward into something that would be better, more common for this day and age, and kind of eliminate some of the gray areas in the rules to where hopefully things like that Polaris thing doesn't happen again, and maybe save some lives in the process. And so I put together what would be a great rough draft to the CR33s, and keep in mind as I go through this, this is a rough draft. And so what I'm in essence referring to is this. It's the CR33s of the SCORE rulebook. Anyone that does what I do, racing, etc., you are very familiar with this, or at some point in time you at least reviewed it or looked at it, but it's relatively old. I mean, this is like 20 years old, etc. And so it definitely could use an update. And I mean, thankfully, it would appear that Norman, Dan, the guys at SCORE seem on board to try and hash something out to update this this section of the rulebook appropriately. Maybe updates will occur, maybe they won't. It's not my decision, it's not my place. I simply was asked to provide my thoughts on this with an update and kind of rewrite this section of the rulebook. And so I went down to the drawing board to some degree and put together a new CR33 section for the SCORE rulebook, which I have already submitted to the boys at SCORE, even though this is a rough draft. So here is mine right here. But I just want to make it clear that, this is not set in stone, so don't fucking panic, don't freak out. This is something that would be possibly adopted entirely, possibly partially adopted, or maybe nothing in this will be adopted and they just keep things the way they are. So there's those three things that could occur, but at a minimum, at least I felt it was worth my time to put something together, because other builders, guys not racing, etc., there's a lot of great safety information in what I'm about to review in chassis configuration and construction that can be applied to everything that we do in the off-road industry. Whether you're just building your own UTV in a garage, or you're building your own luxury pre-runner, or you are having one built, at least I'm arming you with some very valid information in regard to, can we make these things safer, why things should be done a certain way, etc., etc. And so without further ado, let's dive into the specifics of what I'm referring to with CR33s, and that is what you see here at the top of the screen. The occupant compartment is what we are discussing. That's what I have highlighted in red here. And so I'm not, none of what I'm about to discuss pertains to the front half, to the rear half of the chassis. What our concern here is the occupant compartment and the safety to make sure that these, or at least some sort of consistency through the industry or standard, so to speak, is available so that we can have sort of like these safe platforms that everyone understands and knows is good fundamentals, right? Whereas the previous rules unfortunately left a lot of gray area. And if you remember back in the day, it basically was more or less like whatever the fuck Savage felt like was going to be appropriate, and he would chew your fucking head off otherwise, etc. And I've said this before in the last podcast too, but I think it's important to note that, when I was building and younger, and even friends and other guys in the industry back in the Desert Rides days, the forum days with Desert Rides, Desert Rangers, etc. And so it was like a point of pride to have a score tag. Guys would go and get vehicles score tagged that would never have any intention of racing score, simply because it's a point of pride. You could sell your pre-runner for more, to be perfectly frank, your truck for more. It would fetch a higher price on Race Desert because it had a score tag. And the reality here is like it's the inverse. It's mocked now. No one takes that seriously. And I would love to see that rebirth, so to speak, and bring the score tag, so to speak, back to being the pinnacle or the standard that even just the home builders or the shop builders or the fab shop builders, race car builders adhere to, because it's considered the gold standard that we start from, and obviously debate some of the specifics inside of it from there, but like a very good fundamental of this is the direction you need to be going in when it comes to the occupant compartment, so that we reduce injuries, we reduce casualties, we reduce all that stuff as best we can. We will never be able to eliminate fatalities, casualties, or injuries, but at a minimum, we can always strive to move forward in a direction that tomorrow we can do better than we did today or the previous day. And that's the mindset with what I had to approach this with, and the mindset of where I'm going with my update. It's not that everything is total garbage that is not pertaining to this update that I'm about to review. It's that everything moving forward we can be better at. And so in this update, there is definitely vehicles I have built and designed that don't even adhere to some of this update stuff. Obviously, over the course of 20 years, I have learned a lot and have understood and have a better understanding fundamentally today than I did 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, etc. So there's going to be things in this that you may balk at, etc. And I get that. That's going to happen. There's going to be other designers and builders and be like, hey, that seems dumb, or that's not worth it, whatever. And that's fine. Just keep in mind, the whole point here is how do we create the lowest common denominator, a nice standardization platform for everyone sort of to springboard off of, to use as an occupant compartment, regulation, so to speak, that in general push everyone in the industry forward into a safer avenue. So I'm not saying that if you don't adhere to these, you are unsafe and horrible. I'm saying that with tweaks, maybe the next vehicle you build, maybe the next race program you're planning for, you can adhere to some of these and move forward in a more optimized safety position. So I just want to make that clear. I'm not trying to throw anyone under the bus or say anyone's garbage, etc., other than clearly that Polaris car. But when it comes to moving forward, the mindset with my update is how do we optimize this in a standardization factor so everyone understands moving forward we're moving in a generalized direction towards something that is significantly safer than what we previously had. That's where we're going with this. So without further ado, let's get back to the fuckery. So, and it's also important to note that I will volunteer some time into this. If you have questions, you're new to this, you're just now starting a build, you have concerns about your car, maybe you don't understand some of the tube layouts, you want some questions answered, feel free to email me, jason@jehcinc.com. That's jason@jasonelvisheardconsultingincorporated.com. jehcinc.com. And what you can do is send me, you could even send me like an EASM or e-drawings of your chassis. Just send me the occupant compartment. That's all I'd be concerned with. I don't need like proprietary horse shit with your geometry and the suspensions or anything like that. You don't need to bother with any of that. If you have questions on the occupant compartment, whatever it is, send me pictures, etc. I will do my best to answer those in a timely fashion. Obviously, those kind of get shoved to the back burner to some degree, but like every week I'll sit down and try and spend a few hours answering the emails that I get in that are more like questions and not like active issues, i.e. like during my normal operation Monday through Friday and the weekends too, like of dealing with the race team and all the clients and design projects and things like that. Like I have active emails that obviously I have to do. And then the inactive questions, so to speak, the ones I can get to, it might take me a week or two to get to, etc. But like, if you have questions, feel free to reach out. I will do my best to explain things in my thoughts appropriately. And then that way it's better if you just ask as opposed to making an assumption. But hopefully going through this, you're going to learn a lot or understand more by the time I'm done with these new CR33 updates, that there's all this cool stuff that you can do to optimize safety in the occupant compartment when it comes to construction of the chassis, etc. So let's get moving forward. CR33 cage and annual vehicle inspection. Okay, so this is all basically the same as it was before. Noting more like the legal lease bullshit. That, January 1st, 2019, all inspections are done on an annual basis. You can basically have the chassis guy on Instagram, Eric. I mean, he can come to the shop, etc. They will travel, so big deal. You can travel to them, and they can do the inspections. They do a great job. They're very efficient. They're knowledgeable, and they get it done. It's great to work with them. It's a husband-wife team. If you know who I'm referring to, like, they've gone to pretty much every shop that I know of that builds anything along these lines. So, modification, again, if you're tagged and then you modify the stuff, you're probably going to have to be reapproved, even though you got to be reapproved every year anyways. The identification stuff. So again, this is more just legalese stuff, so there's not too much in depth in this. Here we go. So now we're going to start into some of the stuff that's like I'm changing, or my update would be changing some of what is currently in there. So material and welding. Material for roll cage construction must be 4130 chromoly for all trophy truck legends, class 1, trophy truck spec, and pro UTV open. So my suggestion here with this rule change is that we're no longer going to allow anything other than 4130 for these more premier classes. So no more DOM, none of that, which, to be honest, like, I don't even know anyone using that anymore. So again, not too stressed on that. All their classes were, the caveats, they're still able to utilize ASTM 1018, 1026, CDS DOM in place of the 4130 material, which is the standard rule from before. All welding must be the highest quality and full penetration, no undercutting. The fingernail test is one of the things I love to throw in there because it's simple. Anyone can do. You're running your fingernail over the edge. If you feel that little edge, so to speak, you got a little bit of undercut in there, you need to fix that. You need to put another pass in there, especially with the TIG welding stuff. MIG welding is a little different conversation, but yeah, we want to avoid any of that undercut stuff on any of the main things. This goes into some of the stuff. I mean, let's be honest, the guys in our industry are not welding certified. We damn well know we're not. That's off-road. I mean, fuck, I design the race cars and shit like that. My peers that also do designing of race cars, actual race cars, none of us has degrees. Just like all the main weld fab guys, none of them have certs. Like, welcome to off-road racing, bro. Put up or shut up. We're going to put a thing in there that basically states, again, that MIG and TIG welding are the only methods, no exceptions. And then all infield repairs utilizing other forms of welding, i.e. stick welding, etc., must be properly cut out, ground out, and then repaired. I wanted to put that in there just so that we have a little bit more consistency in some of the processes and things. We do not want to have vehicles without those primary processes. And I feel like in this day and age, that's totally fine, especially for the guys that are in various other states, etc., Mexico. Like, the advancements now and the generalities with the industry, pretty much everyone's already doing this. So again, it's not like I'm trying to force anyone to do anything that I would say is more or less industry standard at this point. All vehicles must be welded with the ER70S or ADSD2 or equivalent. Yeah, so I just put kind of this in there as well, because what we want to avoid is we do not want individuals welding these chassis with a type of rod or filler per se that would require actual heat treating to be utilized appropriately. Whereas like on some of the arms and some of the components where we'll go through full heat treating processes, those are not using like an ER80SD2. Those are using rods that would be more complementary to a treating process, which is the inverse of like you can't weld a chassis with those and then not treat it. So again, I just want to have some clarification, standardization in there that no 4130 filler materials are allowed. We want to keep them to sort of these more common standard series that complement non-treated assemblies or a stress relief process, and that's where I'm going here. And I talked to Norman about this too, and he had concerns that having stress relief as a requirement may hinder some of the teams that are struggling either with budgetary constraints or travel or time consumption. And so I didn't feel like putting it in there that it's a mandatory for stress relieving chassis, I feel like I'd get a lot of pushback from builders, even though there is sort of like this unspoken consensus with some of the builders that like that's a normal requirement. I stress relieve all of my race cars that I build. And I am a big fan of that. Once you go down that road, you'll see why. It's fucking phenomenal. So, with that said, we are not heat treating. I just want to make that very clear. And I have done that where I have said, oh yeah, we're treating the chassis. I use it as a generic term, i.e. like Kleenex is a generic. Whereas like the reality is I say treating a chassis when all I'm really doing is stress relieving the chassis, not actually heat treating like I would on suspension components. So to be crystal clear here, I put in here, recommended source. So Jeff at Certified does all my treating, and has for 15 years or so, and a lot of others. And so he's got a proprietary method in which he did not want me to disclose. And the other guys, and you know who you are, who deal with Certified on the treating, I would prefer we don't disclose the specifics and how he does his stress relief process for chassis. He's got like his own little proprietary process. And so I didn't want to disclose that. Jeff would prefer I didn't disclose that. So what we did come up with when I talked to Jeff was sort of like these guidelines that would kind of encapsulate it to where we're making sure people are not going past a normal stress relief process. And so those rudimentary guidelines are going to be max 750 degrees, max 4 hours of exposure at the non-ambient temperature. So what that means is exposure in the oven, and no quenching, no tempering processes. And so that way, if you kind of adhere to that, at least we're not having guys step outside of a normal stress relief and accidentally enter more of a treating. And we don't, again, I can't stress that enough, we do not want the chassis to be treated. We are totally fine with stress relief. I think it's strongly recommended. Several top builders already do this. And you'd be surprised. I don't want to say pricing because I don't know if I'm getting a bro deal from Certified, but it's definitely under a few $1,000s to do a full chassis stress relief process if you call Certified. So with that said, helmet clearance, the old rule used to be 3 inches. I increased it to 4 inches just because of, again, it's an old rule. Things have changed. These vehicles are far more, to use like a rudimentary term, they're pretty wicked. So when we do see rollovers, when we do see things like that, the violent part of it is pretty gnarly, and it's just gotten gnarly over the last 20 years that I've seen stuff. So that extra inch is a big deal. And then stock steel door stuff. There's some leeway if you do have stock steel doors as well, and the requirements for door bars, etc. And that's kind of a normal thing. And I left it in there as a case-by-case basis with Score Tech, because the reality is if you're still on a stock door type of vehicle, there's a high probability you might be infringing on overbuilt in the occupant compartment regardless. So that's more of a case-by-case basis, and that's far more uncommon. Not too many people are building stock door slammers to go race and score, etc. It's not as common as when I first started, put it that way. Far more older days. Headrest requirement, again, this is common, normal from before. Now we're starting to get into some of the stuff where I could piss some people off. Tube junction welding requirements. This is something that just irks me, and some of the builders know what's up. They know they fucking do this, but there is the reality in the big truck industry and on down, so just so we're clear, trophy truck on down, some of these builders, they do not weld under these junctions. Straight up. And Score does not require a check or anything along those lines. I want to reestablish some consistency in that these primary chunks here, you can see them highlighted. I have what I would consider the main occupant compartment junctions, which is 12 of them, that you want to showcase photographic verification of welding under the junction. And I know I'll get some flack for that, like whatever, but here's the reality. All the guys that are building these, the fabricators, like they all have cell phone cameras, etc. It takes a few seconds to turn and burn, snap a photo, put the other tube in, snap another photo, and just do it to a few of the main junctions to create some consistency and some, accountability for the builders, etc. For like making sure this happens. And so I just put kind of example like, okay, so these two tubes obviously start this junction, burn them up. That's a miter plate in there, and I'll get to that in a minute. And then you have two more tubes that come into the junction. Then you weld that up because that gets covered by these other tubes. Then that gets welded because then that section gets covered by this tube. So that every section that is covered, so to speak, by another tube is welded underneath. Now, I make all my guys, all my race cars are done that way. Does it cost more to build the car? Yeah. That's why some of the builders don't do it. They instruct their fab guys not to do it because they're trying to cut hours out, in essence, of the build. And I get that. I just don't agree with that. I think that you need to weld underneath every single junction. And I would love to see SCORE make that a requirement that you're showing photographic evidence. Like let's again, as a whole, everyone in the industry, let's all focus on being better. Let's focus on being so good that other forms of motorsport are like, fuck. These dudes do not fuck around. That is where I want to go. And that's where I'm building my stuff to. So I think that is something that we could easily, as a group, kind of come to a consensus on. And frankly, I mean, I'm kind of like the old school stuff. Like that used to be a thing back in the day, like a requirement. Like you'd have to weld underneath every single junction properly. You know, no more just slapping the chassis together, pulling them off the table and turning and burning all the main stuff and call it a day, you know. The next thing is the dead tubes. So this wasn't really in the rules before. I put this in here just to showcase. A lot of guys that are probably going to watch this already know what a dead tube is. So I've got like a rudimentary definition, but basically you want to avoid like this stuff here in the red, which is tubes that just kind of deaden into flat chunks of areas. And I did mention this in that other video about the Polaris thing too, but yeah, we got to no more of this bullshit. Knock this fucking stuff off, bro. This is not, you know, backyard NHRA drag car shit. Let's have some resemblance of caliber engineering and fabrication. So just knock this shit off. Fuck. I mean, back in the day with like, you know, desert rangers, desert rides. If you showed a picture with a dead tube in it, man, the guys on the forums would just tear you apart. Hilarious, but you know. Anyways, junction welding of various material thicknesses. So this goes on to maybe I need to switch that. 12 and 11 might have to be switched because this actually carries further forward from the section that is 10. Yeah, so I'm going to make a note. 12 needs to be moved up and switched with 11 because 12 is carrying forward from what 11 is. Let me just make a note of that. See, told you, this is a living and breathing rough draft. Okay. And so what this is I'm carrying more information forward from this aspect here, which is you have to weld under the junctions, and that is primary material wall thickness tubes are going to be welded together first, then the thinner wall tubes. So in this specific example, the red tubes are 095 wall. So all of those get welded first, then the 065. What you want to avoid is welding 095 tube to 065 tube in a junction, because now you're basically just creating a situation where that's only going to be as tear strength or as robust in a tearing fashion or failure fashion as that 065 wall. And you want to avoid that. There's a reason why that tube was 095 wall or thicker, 083 wall or 120 wall, as opposed to 065 wall. And I've seen some of you guys do this shit. You'll put like a fucking 120 wall tube that's welding into a junction where they're like overlapping 065 stuff. And it's like, whoa, come on, dude. Come on, guys. So the thicker wall material needs to be welded first in the junction, then the thinner wall material can come into the junction. If you're struggling to figure that out, well, you may need to change your layup up. You may have to adjust some of the tubes, etc. But you want to avoid thicker wall tubes getting welded into a junction on top of thinner wall tubes. I think that, again, you're going to knock that shit off. And then now we're moving on to miter plates. Again, some of these builders are not putting miter plates into these junctions. It's critical. I don't know why. It takes a few minutes extra. I mean, I do know why. They're trying to save money by not doing it. I get it. Labor is expensive. My guys are expensive. My guys are some of the top dollar guys as far as fabrication employees go. It's a cost incursion. I get it. Everything adds time. Everything is expensive in this sport. But at a minimum, I think as a whole, if we can all move forward in this direction, This is better. So miter plates, a must. Top builders, a must. I know several peers of mine that this is always going to happen. They will never not do a junction like this without a proper miter plate or partition, whatever you want to call it. The point being is this is going to be a requirement per my update, so to speak. Not only is it a requirement, it also has to be a minimum wall thickness for the miter plate as the material that it's welding to, i.e. 120 wall tube, 125 plate, or a 188. Like you could do a 3/16 miter plate in there if it's a 120 wall tube. Totally fine. What you shouldn't do is you shouldn't do like an 065 miter plate in a 120 wall tube junction. See where I'm going with that? We want to keep those materials the same. A little bit of a stickler, but come on. That's just a proper way of doing things. You also need to have a gas vent hole in there, but anyone doing this, they probably already know that. I'd say a 1/4 inch is what I put in there for like the standard requirement. I actually usually cut mine to 1/2 inch or 3/4. I usually do larger holes just to save a little weight, I guess. A weird thing, caveat of mine, but like it fucking matters in that application. But again, the point being is there's a hole in there. The miter plate is the thickness of the material at a minimum, and it's in all of those junctions. So all of the stuff around the occupant compartment, requirement for miter plate. If you want to not put miter plates in the back half of the chassis or the front half, I don't really give a shit. Again, we're only focused on occupant compartment here. We want to save lives. We want to create a consistency and standardization that the entire world of motorsports will look up to, that these guys do not fuck around. So next, multi-tube junction alignment. So this is when you've got multiple tubes coming into the same junction. You want to have overlap of the miter. You do not want them to kind of just spread. So here's an example of this. The blue would be what I would call a pass. The red would be what I would call a fail. See how there's spacing between these tubes and this sort of angled junction. These are just generic drawings, but it could be in a few different spots inside the occupant compartment, B-pillar, roof, door, whatever. You can't have spacing between these tubes. They need to be at a minimum touching, but actually what I want and what I did put in here is a 20% of the diameter of the tube overlap. I feel like that's a very small amount that you can just denote. So we want a little overlap, not just touching tip to tip. Give them a little more overlap. And I feel like that's a very good thing. And so this will avoid the premature cracking or failure that can occur because you're basically just landing these with the straight tube in between, and you're putting a lot of force between this little like noodle section is what I'd like to say. And so let's get rid of that. Again, step up the standards. A lot of the top guys are already doing this stuff. So again, this is more industry standard for my peers that are building top level cars and trucks, as opposed to like trying to force all of them to do something. Like I've learned this stuff from guys older than me that have done this stuff. Like I'm not the first one to do this stuff or anything along those lines. I just happen to be, for some weird reason, the asshole that was asked to put together an update to this. And so that's what I did. But this is all stuff I've learned from more experienced and significantly smarter individuals than myself. It's not like I just made this up from thin air. So the guys that are currently, in this mindset, so to speak, are already building to this, like, this is where I'm getting stuff from. So again, just bringing things back to more of what I would consider professional standard and making that clear to the rest of the industry and the motorsports world as a whole, that this is where we stand with our specifications and requirements for the occupant compartment of the chassis. Okay, so frame rail vehicles. So here's another thing that's kind of like a weird caveat. I've never done this. But if you're trying to do like the bolt and stuff where you're bolting through the cab of a vehicle to the chassis, I rewrote this section and had some caveats in there that I feel like are really good, even though the high probability of anyone watching this, they'll never run into this or deal with this. But let's just keep this in mind, that this is definitely something that's plausible for some of the builds. And so this would be like a cab truck, certain classes, obviously not like trophy truck or some of the higher classes per se. But when you're doing this stuff, you're going to want both plates. I put in here that you're going to want a shear tube, so a tube that slips in between that helps prevent those plates from shifting. So I call it like a shear tube. That tube itself is this one here in red. It's just like a slip tube that would be in the chassis, and I'll get to those in a little bit too. But that tube cannot be straight cuts. It has to be sort of like a nice beveled notch so that you don't have like a shear line, so to speak. The other thing I put in here too is that the bolts have to be properly shanked through the materials. Those main plates need to be 3/16 material. And then I kind of have this thing in here. And I even put in here that like I can provide DXFs. So like Score Tech can have like a list of DXFs I could draw up real quick that they could send out to guys. Like, here's a DXF for you to laser cut these plates. Done, you know, just to make some consistency in that. And this is kind of gnarly, but like, again, hopefully because this is a lot of work and gnarly, it will help avoid guys wanting to do this, because this isn't the best way. I'd much rather just have a proper structure just welded in. But again, we can't not have this in here. When I talked to Norman about this, he got worried that if we start deteriorating some of stuff in here like this, that might be an issue for some of the lower classes, and that's all. So now we're diving into roll cage tubing size specifications. This is where I really change a lot of stuff. CR33 016 section. So this is for Trophy Truck Legends, Trophy Truck Spec. Again, those are basically identical. Class 1 and Pro UTV Open. The reason I include Pro UTV Open, because this is like that tube chassis UTV class where the guys are legitimately 100 plus mile an hour vehicles and taken significantly more serious. And so I took a lot of, so we went a little crazy on this. If you remember the old ones, like let me see if I can pull up the old one. So here is the old diagram. Everyone fucking remembers this thing. It's like straight out of fucking NASCAR. Some shit like that. I don't know where the fuck this came from, but yeah, it's got to be something like that. I mean, you're going back to like the 90s, early 90s, late 80s on this guy. And so for obvious reasons that could use some improvement. So here is my variant of that, and here's the list. And so we'll go through the list, but the blue structure is our core structure, so to speak. So that's going to have your A pillars, your B pillars, things along those lines. The orange is our roof. The green is going to be the B pillar. Yellow is going to be our floor. This sort of purple pink, or the pinkish stuff, is like the intrusion bar stuff. The red bits are going to be our gussets for the main structure. This light blue, and it's not a good contrast, it's hard to see in this, but this A pillar support is light blue, so that's A pillar support. This purple right here is another tube I denoted in there. So this purple tube, which are these front down tubes, so to speak, from the A pillar to the bulkhead, and these floor tubes in yellow, that was actually something that Norman requested to me. He was pretty adamant that we needed some verbiage in there and some dictation in this to help guys understand some more stuff with the floor and some more stuff with that forward firewall tube requirements. So some of this stuff, again, was like kind of suggested to me from Norman on like, hey, why don't we discuss this or whatever? Because we kind of went through a bunch of these sort of ideas, concepts, if you will, right? And so some of those I put in there based on a conversation that we had, which I agree, because it never hurts to push further into getting stuff safer. Because the reality here is like you're basically arguing like how much less safe than this sort of update should we dial back to, right? I know it sounds really weird, but like that's kind of where we're going here, is like, where do we draw that line? It's very difficult. I'm trying to do the best I can to like not piss people off, while also simultaneously like, where can we be optimized in this? Because this is probably going to piss some people off, I guarantee you. Like some peers of mine are going to be like, hey dude, like that's kind of dumb. And I get that. And there's going to be some debate. Again, this is a rough draft, and I'd love to hear thoughts, and I'd love people to question me and debate me. Like I'm by no means the end all be all. I know I'm not a moron, but at the same time, like I'd love to hear other people's thoughts too, because like there's a lot of great designers and builders other than myself that are significantly experienced in all this stuff. And so anyway, so here we go. Dark blue, main structure that includes A pillar, B pillar, mid rail, dash tube, harness bar, forehead bar, and B pillar roof crossbar, forward floor, bulkhead tubes. So for this, that primary blue structure, basically for trophy truck, 6100, class 1, those are going to be 2-inch by 120 wall minimum, 4130. And that's, again, very common. Almost everyone's already doing that. Pro UTV Open, 1.75-inch by 095 wall minimum, simply because they are significantly lighter. And then I do have some caveats in here that, like, the down tube for your A pillar as it leaves the B pillar and comes down. Some of the builders will run 175 inch, 120 wall into that 2 inch, and that's fine for that down bar. I'm cool with that. Or if they transition that to like a 2 inch 095 coming down. Again, fine with that too. But again, that A pillar coming up and over all the way to the B pillar junction is a 120 wall. So those are just two caveats because, again, just to not be too nitpicky, but that's fine because there are some builders that do that, and that's totally fine. Bending and rolling specifications. So no bends can have a CLR centerline radius less than 6 inches, and no rolled roof section can have a CLR less than 60 inches over the span of the roof, so rolling. I feel like those are really good numbers. Again, if you feel like I overstepped or we may need to pull that back or you have a different suggestion, let me know. Again, rough fucking draft, bro. We're just getting this ball rolling on where can we land on something that's better than what we have. I felt like that's a good starting point. So that 60-inch over the span, just to be crystal clear, that would mean like the Masons are totally fine. My Class 1 is totally fine. The Alumacraft spec truck is totally fine. So that you understand where I'm going with that, I'm not trying to outlaw those. Although it would be in my best interest to do everything I can to make the Masons and anything Craig Hall designs not be score legal. That way, I have a much better chance at being successful with my new platforms. I'm just saying, that could happen. But the reality here is this does cover pretty much all that stuff is already under that umbrella. So all good on that. A-pillar junctions. Front A-pillar roof junction where the A-pillar meets up with the forehead cross tube and A-pillar support tube. So this is, if I'm sitting in the race truck, it's right here. It's this junction kind of just chilling, in front corner. And so this is, again, very important. I brought some of this stuff up on that Polaris video, but this is what we want to see. You want to see the tube coming across the forehead bar intersect with the A-pillar support tube just shy or just post the bend, so that I put in there 50%. So at least 50% of that junction needs to be in the flat chunk, so where the bend stops, so to speak. And the reason I like that is because we're not relying on the bend to kind of help hold that junction together. As I said before, the bends create inconsistencies in the wall thickness. They also create stress risers at the start and stops. So it's better to have that post. And then we have a gusset, again, matching diameter. I'll get to that in a minute. Matching diameter gusset that spans down below to where the bend starts and stops. And I'll get into the gussets later. But what the point is here is we want those to intersect at the backside of that bend, minimum of 50% into the straight. Again, I could be a little nitpicky. Someone could totally argue some of that bits. I'm just trying to create some standardization or at least get us thinking in the mindset of where do we draw that line? Okay, maybe it's 20%. Maybe 50% is too greedy. Maybe we'll go 40%. Do you see what I'm saying? 40% of the tube diameter. So if it's a 2-inch tube, that's a 1-inch, just so we're clear. Okay, so that's that was reviewing the forward junction. Now let's review the rear junction where it would be the B pillar in essence. Vertical roof crop tube at one location, like the below diagram. These variations are approved. Okay, so this is the B pillar chunk where the A pillar meets the B pillar. And here's sort of the 3 variations I have in here for legality or whatever you want to call it that are approved. Blah, blah, blah. So you have miter in the junction, miter post junction, or the bend. So bend of the air reel down to a junction must be at least 50% welded to the straight section. So again, we don't want this bend to be forward of the junction, so to speak. We want at least 50% of the B pillar main tube and the cross tube coming up behind your head to be into that flat. So again, I note that 50%. So that means 1 inch if it's a 2-inch tube. Weld to the straight, so part of the bend can be in there. Or what's best is you have the bend slightly aft of it, but we also don't want the bend being too far aft. So I put in 2-inch rearward is the max. So the start of the bend can only be 2 inches rearward max of where this junction is. And we don't, again, that's because you're just getting into some wompiness if you're staying outside of that. And then for the miters, yeah, this is, for those who do not know, miters are score approved. I designed a trophy truck in 2017 that has raced multiple Baja 1000s that has a miter junction like this. So for multiple seasons, it's been fine. It's totally fine. I fucking love these junctions. Again, welded properly. They're going to have the proper partition or miter plate in there, and then all of that stuff is welded underneath in a process. So it's very time consuming, but it's fucking dialed. So you can have the miter in the junction, which is incredibly strong, or you can have the miter post or aft the junction, and then obviously you need something to help gusset and this can be a case-by-case basis, but the point being is getting plenty of weld surface area in there. So like in this specific example, I've got some tubes that would represent kind of like some of the normal, quote-unquote normal, shock mount supports that you would see in a lot of these tube chassis applications that tie a lot of that together, and look at just a lot of weld adhesion to that whole chunk. And so the rear down tube can be, like if you're doing the bend and slip, like I was saying before, there are some builders that will step that down from a 2-inch right after the B pillar. It'll step down to a 175, 120 wall, or if it's a miter post bend, someone might step that down to a 2-inch 195. I'm just trying to put some minimums in here to create some consistency. That's all. So obviously there's can be some back and forth debate on some of these specific numbers, and there's obviously going to be people that think differently than me in this. So again, don't just take what I'm saying as this is, if you don't have this, you're fucked. You can't even show up at a score race. Obviously that's not the fucking case. Slip tube for the A-pillar. Slip tubes are approved for the A-pillar when deployed in the fashion below. So this is very important. Some guys do the slip tubes, some guys don't. Again, we're not here to judge or say whatever it is. I've had to use slip tubes in some situations, and so have other builders. And so what we want here is to just have a good understanding of what like a slip tube requirement would be to make sure this is all kosher. And that is the slip tube itself is going to need a minimum of 4 plug welds. You cannot have a slip in the A-pillar anywhere else in the mid-rail, so we don't want slips like forward A-pillar, whatever. This is just the junction where the B-pillar is and the A-pillar meet. And you're going to have the slip no more than 2 inches rearward from the A-B pillar junction. So this slip right here can't be too far back from that junction. Ideally, you want it in the junction. And then the internal slip needs to be the same wall thickness as the A-pillar and a minimum length of 4 inches and max length of 8 inches. So you want a minimum of like 2 inches going into each side is where I'm going with this. Then you're going to want 4 plug welds. So 2 plug welds per side on each side. This piece that goes inside, it needs to be notched or coped. It cannot be a straight cut. It cannot be an angle cut. Those create too much of a like a stress riser and could lead to a serious failure by wanting to tear the exterior tube. So we want to see those coped. So like just like a normal notch, and then a nice bevel around that edge. And that's the safest way to do a slip tube. The plug welds need to be a minimum of a 1/2 inch diameter for TIG welding. So you have 2 per side, so 4 total in each junction. And 3/4 of an inch for MIG welding. So obviously on TIG welding, a little bit more precise, a little bit different with filler deployment. And so you can fill those up pretty nice. But on a MIG gun, we want to get penetration between the parent material and that base as best as we can. So we want to really dig in. So we want to see like a 3/4 inch deal and just fill that whole thing up and get it nice and warm, and don't be shy with the MIG gun. So that's why I put those in for that. And this would be like a proper slip tube situation, etc. Mid-rail junctions. The mid-rail junctions must line up. Floor junctions. Again, I'm just re-emphasizing that we want the junctions to line up properly. We do not want to have dead tubes or scatters. And so I'm just kind of noting where some of those junctions we would want those to meet. More standard than you'd think. Most of the builders now are already adhering to this. So just kind of, again, just putting in what is considered more standardization into this. So here we go. Light blue A-pillar support tubes. Definitely going to get some pushback on this one. These tubes need to intersect the top of the A-pillar where the front forehead tube meets with the A-pillar. Again, I already referenced that, but that's this junction up there. Then it needs to have a clear line of load path between that A-pillar support coming down all the way to that front corner. And on the big truck stuff, 2-inch by 0.65 is what I would do. I love matching diameters. I've spoke about this in that Polaris video. An A-pillar support tube like this, if you do a non-matching diameter, it in essence kind of acts as like a spear that wants to puncture the above tube. Whereas if it's a matching diameter and you're going to that A-pillar from the A-pillar support, the load pass, so to speak, is carried onto that A-pillar tube a lot better, as opposed to being smaller and wanting to almost puncture that tube in the event of a serious rollover. So anytime you can do matching diameter stuff for the occupant compartment, I feel like is a must. And clearly I'm putting some dictation in my rule update to kind of move the industry towards matching diameter occupant compartment stuff. And you'll see that more, and that theme will arise too. And so I was saying Pro UTV open tubes need to be a minimum of 175/065, 4130, because their chassis would be 175, whereas all the big truck stuff, Class 1's 2-inch 065. If these A-pillar support tubes end up with a bend in them anywhere, then I'm requiring them to be 095 wall minimum. So if it's just straight tension compression straight up, like 065 would be fine. B-pillar main wall tubes, again, totally up for fucking debate, so we'll start this process. But these, I would say, if you do not have, so here's the main layout. I mean, these two on the left here are pretty much the main layouts for almost everything being built these days. You do see this one on the right is kind of like the Pro UTV open and stuff like that. We'll see that on occasion. But again, I do not want to see this in like a trophy truck or a Class 1, because we don't have a nice support for that B-pillar, A-pillar corners. I'd like to see that, and that's obviously why I put these in here as kind of like a generic, hey, we need something coming to that corner appropriately. Now for big truck stuff, Class 1s, I have in here that these need to be a minimum of 2-inch 065 wall if they have no bends in them. So if they're just straight tension compression tubes, matching diameter, 065 wall minimum. That doesn't mean it's a requirement. It means you can definitely go thicker. I'm just putting in minimums. If it's bent or has a bend in any of these tubes, which does happen sometimes, I've seen builders do this, then now you have to go to a minimum of 095 wall. You see where I'm going with that? Tension compression tube only with no bend. 065 is the requirement. If there's a bend in it, 095 is a requirement, and that's with matching diameters, just to be clear. So if it's a 2-inch, i.e. trophy truck, those have to be 2-inch diameter tubes. No more 1.5 or 1.75 for this stuff. Pro UTV open would be 175. So, orange roof tubes. These tubes need to be a minimum of 1.5 by 065 wall for 4130 for trophy truck legend, stuff like that. 1.25 by 065 wall. Again, I'm just setting in minimums. Some vehicles don't really even put shit up here, to be fair, but I'm just saying, hey, this is at a minimum what I want to see. And then there's obviously debate in it. Here's a few patterns, so to speak, that are approved, or what I would consider approved. We want to have something that, if you notice, there's a theme here. We're supporting the spine of the chassis somehow, and we're also supporting the front A-pillar junction somehow as well. So these are what almost all of the professionally built vehicles adhere to, this layout and format. And so if there's something different than this, that doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong or unsafe. It's just these would be considered far more standard or normal for our industry and application. Now let's get into bending of the roof tubes, which is common. I've done it too, done it a lot. I do like it. It does add, it does help to some degree. But when bending the roof tubes to A-pillar, it's acceptable to bend the tubes up to 1 inch measured from center line of the bent tubes to the tangent side of top of the A-pillar. So again, we don't want to bend them too crazy or get insane with it. I feel like 1 inch is a good number. There's a perfect thing that like we could debate on. Oh, 1.25 is better, or 1.5 is fine. Okay, I get that. What I'm trying to avoid is like 6 fucking inches. Like you don't want some fucking massive cone structure up there. Like holy fuck. Yeah. But again, and if these tubes end up with a bend in them, maybe we require them to be 095 now. See what I'm going with that sort of theme there? If there's no bend, have that baseline requirement of 065. If we're putting a bend in it, go up to 095. And non-matching diameter roof tubes. When running non-matching diameter roof tubes, i.e. I run 1.25 inches on like a UTV that has 1.75 inch mains, or like on a trophy truck that has 1.5 inch roof tubes that does have 2-inch main structure, I want those tubes tangent to the top surface. So if it's a non-matching diameter, like in this specific example, what I put in here was an 1.5 inch tube, and these are 2-inch main tubes, you can see how we notch it tangent to the top. So it's not notch on center line, it's notched tangent to the top of the roof. And that's for non-matching tube diameters in the roof tubes. Red gussets for the occupant compartment and chassis. Again, here's the main chunks of red gussets. So you're going to have those 4 per side. And those need to be matching diameter to the main structure. So 2-inch for the big trucks, 175 for the UTVs, and a minimum of 065 wool. We also want to see the this is good because this is definitely some changes from the previous rules where they would allow like these fucking plate ones. They're just fucking knives, and I'll get to that in a second. But acceptable gussets can be fabricated from either tube or formed plate work. Pretty fucking cool what some of these fabricators can do. All tube gussets must be the same diameter as the case structure, minimum thickness of 065. So again, matching diameter. Notice the consistency and theme here. Plate gussets can either be 90-degree formed piece or round formed sheet metal from a minimum of 065 material. Bent tube gussets are allowed if they meet the distance requirement mentioned below. So some guys like to do what we call the potato chips. Again, that's fine, because what these gussets are really doing here is it's providing a significant amount of hold between those 2 main tubes. We're increasing welding surface area, and we're increasing that connection to prevent that from wanting to pull apart. That's what we're doing here. So, like I'm saying, if you want to do sick boy potato chip gusset, totally fine. Just make sure it's a minimum of that 065 in that. And we want 2 inches measured from the internal of the junctions. Okay, so if we're using a tube junction or a tube for these gussets, we want a minimum of 2 inches here. The old rules are something different, I get that, but realistically here, like if you have a 2-inch tube in there, which again, matching diameter, and this edge is more than 2 inches from this edge, you're fine. Weld that thing up, you're totally good. Now on these ones, that are the plate ones, we're gonna say 3-inch because the plate comes all the way down past, it's further into this junction, so to speak. So we'll go 3 inches from edge to edge, and again, I think that's totally fine. We could have some debate on some of that, but this is totally fine for keeping that junction or helping keep that junction from wanting to tear apart. Here's what these would look like as acceptable gussets, so to speak, for these corners. Okay, yeah, I'll get to that in a second. Now, for the front A-pillar gussets in the roof, and I kind of hinted at this previously, but these need to be a minimum of 065 wool material, again, matching diameter, and the location needs to be such as the diagram below. You're basically spanning this bend, and you want this bottom part here to be at a minimum 50% into the straight or prior to the bend so that you're spanning the bend appropriately with this junction as a whole so that in the event of a serious rollover, etc., you're not relying on the bent section of the tube to provide the robustness, so to speak, for that from wanting to cave in or fail. So again, we want to span that. Very important, matching diameter. Single plate gussets. Now here's where we're going to what I just referred. Single plate gussets are no longer allowed. No. Get this shit the fuck out of here. This is so unsafe. It makes me cringe. It's a plate gusset like this. It's basically just a fucking knife on the center of the tube. It's like asking for it just to puncture that tube. So yeah, that is definitely a no-go. Get those out of here. Let's everyone as a whole, we need to step our game up. Let's all focus on being the pinnacle of all motorsports off-road racing. Again, same with like these knife edge style plates. No. You're creating a fucking edge that is just a stress riser just wants to puncture that fucking tube. Get those out of here. No moss on that. So again, these not allowed. These allowed. Proper, not proper. Fight me. No, just kidding. That is just again my opinion, but fuck, if you ever see how these fail, that is some scary shit, man. You definitely will pucker right there and be like, well, I ain't fucking doing that again. So again, it's just experience. All this stuff is, I've been obsessed with this shit for 20 fucking years. It's experience. It's not like I just out of the middle of nowhere just started designing race trucks. No. I've been doing this a long time, learning from very smart people and seeing shit get fucked up and fucking stuff up myself. So like, again, the reason I know those are a no-go is because I've seen what happens with them. Main door bar tube. This must meet up with the A-pillar support tube and the mid-rail. So again, this is what we're dictating as our main tube. They do kind of have this in the initial. If you remember, they had it the other way, which is not my preference, but we're just going to put in that we got to have some sort of main tube in here, some sort of there's different builders can have slightly different styles to that, but the point being is I want to put a requirement in that has to be a 2-inch 095 tube minimum for at least that main door bar. And same with like the UTV, main door bar, that one main, let's do 1 3/4 095 minimum. If they end up with a bend in them, again, very important, I then would like to see a minimum of 120 wall if you do have to put a bend in those. And again, you're starting to see some of the bits that I'm referring to with I would rather keep consistency. I don't like bends. So you're starting to see some of the flavors come through. So what we're trying to also do here is prevent stuff from entering the cab. So in this specific deal, what we're trying to prevent is a structure that like is 18 inches by 8 inches, like you vision a front UTV bumper or something of the like, trying to enter the cab. So we want to close those spaces up. So on a case-by-case basis, there may be something where we'd have to add another tube in here, add a tube down here. You see I'm getting at to kind of close off some of these larger sections. And I feel like that's very important. The other thing to note too with this, and I didn't mention it on the roof stuff, but like for my cars I'm making now, I'm actually doing things a little above and beyond this to some degree. The door panels that we are making for the sides of our chassis, and same with the roof. So our door panels on the sides are actually going to be Kevlar wrapped. So we're going to add a layer of ballistic protection that will sit over that door, and so the tube structure underneath, or the door tubes in essence, are going to act more like support structure for what is going to be normal 10 aluminum that will be wrapped with a few layers of Kevlar, and then that will be bolted to the side. Now for the roof, like on my trophy truck and the class 1s, we're doing like 080 aluminum that is wrapped with Kevlar, and that is what we're doing for our roofs, for the top roof section on the cars I'm doing now. And that's not very heavy. I know it sounds insane, but like it's really not that heavy and it's not that expensive. And I'll show more on this in the next few months or so as we get closer to turnkeying our vehicles. I'll post more on that, but it's just something I'm doing to our roof plate work and our side panels to add some ballistic protection in the event of fuckery. Again, nothing in there and nothing in this is a requirement. This is just something I'm doing. And I know a few other guys might be dabbling with that too. But just to add some safety to this stuff. And so now let's move on to intrusion bars, pink windshield, and intrusion bar support tubes. And again, this is very important as well. These tubes in the windshield have various layouts that are approved, both single and double. Yeah, so single and double. I've done both. My trophy truck is a single, just to be crystal clear. But we do have some stipulations in this. For dual intrusion bars left, so I put in 2-inch by 065. Again, I love the matching diameter stuff. So there could be some change in that to say like, okay, fine. For the dual intrusion bars, we'll put in there like 1-inch 065 minimum. Or I'm sorry, 1.5 065 minimum, which is another standard, even though I love the matching diameter stuff. So that's what I've been designing to the last few seasons. And then if you're running a single, like on a trophy truck like mine, minimum of 2-inch 095 wall. So like ours is a 2-inch 095 tube for that intrusion bar. And then one thing too that like not all the builders do, but I feel like is very important, is what would be considered intrusion bar support tubes. And so this will be a tube that comes from where the intrusion bar lands and then goes to the door where your A-pillar support tube comes down, and it connects those. And the reason that's very important is to prevent if a very hard hit happens to that A-pillar support tube and it wants to collapse or push down and possibly push that door bar out or move it. Well, if you have an intrusion bar support tube like I have pictured here to hold that junction, it's not that it's supporting the intrusion bar. What we're really doing here is we're shoring up the A-pillar support tube and the front A-pillar tube, which again, I hammered on this in that Polaris video, how important that front A-pillar is, because when you roll, that's one of the scariest things is seeing that fucker start to come down or collapse in. So you want to prevent that. You want to, yeah. So if you watch that video, you'll see what I mean. But the point being is, these intrusion bar support tubes, not all the builders put them. I'd like to see every builder put them in, because it shores up the A-pillar support tube's ability to maintain the front of that A-pillar from collapsing in. So again, you could do matching diameter like I love, 2-inch 065, and we go from there. But I would love to start seeing that as a necessary thing on top of the intrusion bar type stuff. And so there's that. Forward chassis 8-pillar support tubes. Again, this is something that Norman did, I guess you'd say, request or mention to me that he would like to see in here. And these tubes may vary in specific layout because obviously builder resistance, but basically we're connecting the dash tube 8-pillar to somewhere in the bulkhead. And various builders do this various ways. But what I want to see is an 095 wall tube that helps support bullshit from entering the cab in there. And so, again, matching diameter on the big truck stuff. I put in here 2-inch 095 is a requirement for these now. And then for the Pro UTV Opens, 175 by 095. And then, again, if you have a bend in those, then you need to step them up to 120 wall. So, different strokes for different folks. But, yeah, this is just another thing I feel was not in the previous rules that is very important. Floor structure tubes, again, another thing that Norman, I guess you'd say, requested, etc., put in here. And so there's no real emphasis on this, obviously, with the old rules. So in these rules, are the updates, so to speak. What I would like to see is that if you run something that helps transition load back into the center of the chassis or helps carry load in the center of the chassis from like these sort of junctions. And obviously on big truck stuff, class ones, etc., like these rear B-pillar stuff under your ass, so to speak, like those chunks where the rear pivot boxes are or the housing for the rear trailing arms, they're a little funky with different builders, or everyone has their own flavor. So like, again, this is just more like a generic concept I'm going with here, that I want to see some sort of transition from those corners into the center of the chassis, etc., to help kind of support. And to make it simple, I just put in there 1.5 inch 065 wall. I also put in here that we want them, if they are non-matching diameter, we want those to be tangent to the bottom of the chassis. So similar to how the roof was, where it's tangent to the top, we want it tangent to the bottom. Again, might be a little the nitpicky side, but that's just my flavor. So again, up for debate on some of this bits. And then we want some sort of structure, resemblance of a structure in this back section that kind of spans underneath to carry some load path between like the pivot boxes and things like that. So I put in there like a minimum of something in there. It can be removable, it can be whatever, like 1.5 inch 065, just to put some very basic minimums in there. Some guys don't really have anything at all, but it'd just be nice to have something that helps carry some load path in there. And then moving forward, so everything I was just reviewing were all of my updates that pertain to Trophy Truck Spec, Class 1, and Pro UTV Open. So for the lower classes, so to speak, I obviously pull back some of those rules or pull back some of those specifics because we don't need to be as harsh on these guys, if that makes sense. And so I pull back some of that stuff and then kind of transition to more of like the standard score stuff that we're used to, where it goes by weight. The only difference here is I have primary and secondary or substructure. So primary is the blue, and substructure would be the green, etc., other than the doors are tan, and then you have the red. So I delineate now that substructure in green, those can be stepped down in both diameter and wall thickness per builder specifications or thoughts, whereas primary structure pretty much adheres to the same thing that we had before, and it's very generic and open. And then I do say the gussets, so the red gussets, I'd like to see the adhesion of the gusset rule the same as above, so our CR33 028. So the same gusset rule would apply, which is what I reviewed up here. So that would still apply to the other ones moving forward. And then the door bar tan, these must be the same diameter materials in main structure and 095 wall. So again, I'm somewhat adhering to the same flavor and style as before. I would just like to see an 095 thickness, same diameter tube as the main structure, as that door bar thing with that same 18-inch by 8-inch sort of envision something fucking trying to come into the cab. Case-by-case basis, obviously, ScoreTech can deal with that, blah, blah, blah. And then UTV platforms with stock chassis and pans. These are kind of the oddball outs because I know what you guys are doing. I've designed a fuckload of these. You're basically using a lot of that stock material in place. So wherever you keep that pan or stock chassis material. Obviously, some of the rules can't really apply to that because you're keeping that. That's part of the class specifications. So, like, we're not going to force, or anyone's going to force you just to tear all that shit. Like, no, those in essence are just going to have more requirements based above mid-rail. So, it'd be like the aftermarket cage side of things, the additions to that, to where, like, you're not having to replace everything, even though I would love to get away from using any stock UTV chassis in racing other than... and I'm definitely going to get some flack for this one, other than the XX or the speed cars. I fucking said it. And the reason for that is they actually do a much better job of chassis safety in those platforms. If you see them naked with the other platforms, you start understanding where I'm going with a lot of this stuff, and you start paying attention to the little notes I make and the details I talk about with junctions and things like that and how the layout is. Well, you'll see why. And I know that will ruffle some feathers, and I get that. But the point being is it would be phenomenal if we just got rid of all the UTV stock pans and floors. But I understand that's not going to happen. That's a dream of mine, but they're just unsafe. That's just the reality, and I get that. Those dudes that are racing them, they know they're taking risks. They get that too. Everybody does the best we can to create the best situation and safety. Fortunately, typically speaking, those cars are not that fast. They're rarely 100-plus mile per hour vehicles, etc., etc. But the point being is, in some situations, obviously you're not going to be able to adhere to these more rigorous rules. We get that. I get that. There's going to be some back and forth. There's going to be some figuring out. If we do an update to a CR33s in general, like I'm suggesting here, a lot of this stuff, like, there's still going to be figuring out. There's still going to be some back and forth, and I'm sure there's going to be some debate in some of these numbers I have and some of the dictation I have, and I get that. Totally fine. I welcome it because this is how we move forward and we make things better for everyone. And then again, this is just some of the more normal stuff that was already in the requirements for waiver. You could have a waiver if you don't like the FIA spec. And here's the best part is, like, in talking with Norman, etc., he was pretty adamant that, like, they're no longer going to allow FIA spec bullshit. Yeah, FIA. Oh, FIA. Come on. FIA does not mean it's safe by any means. You've seen, or no. If you understand where I'm going with that, there are definitely some vehicles that are incredibly cringe that are FIA certified. So, again, I've lost all faith in that too. Although FIA typically does better, but let's be crystal clear here. There's some sketch as fuck shit that can pass for FIA specs. So, again, with the mentality of why can't we make SCORE the premier, the standard again? And I fundamentally believe that you can build a competitive car and you can build a safe car at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive. Like, it's totally doable. And if everyone focuses on this direction moving forward, and I'm not referring to, like, my specific peers and, like, unlimited class, etc. What I'm referring to is the new builders, the new guys, stuff like that are just coming up the ranks or just starting out with a fab shop or whatever. They can take a lot of this information and deploy it in their everyday fabrication of off-road vehicles in general and create significantly safer platforms because of it. The matching diameter stuff, the junctions on how they're supposed to be laid out, the miter plates, hell, the fucking stress relieving. I even put in here, like, where to call. Fucking certified. Give them a shout. They can do it. I told you it's like under $2,000 easy for doing, a full chassis like a class 1 or a trophy truck. So obviously stuff on down. And you could do it with UTVs. Why the fuck not? And so this is just a great rough draft, a good start to hopefully what is going to be some change and some updates into the CR33s with SCORE to avoid what we saw these last few months with some other stuff. But again, if anyone has questions, concerns, feel free to email me. If you are building a car, have a car, and you want my opinion or some advice on maybe where to put some tubes, how to change something, or whether or not something needs to be changed, again, email me. I'll volunteer some time for this to help you guys, because this is not a competitive advantage or something along the lines. Again, we're focused here on the occupant compartment. I'm not focused on trying to make you less competitive or fuck with you. My concern is, as a whole, making everyone safer. And like I'm saying, and as you can see in some of this dictation I have, the wall thicknesses I'm dictating and some of the bits, like, I'm not trying to add a ton of weight. We're still maintaining the resemblance of race car bullshit here, And I do a lot of thinner wall material in my chassis. Like, my trophy truck is a lot of thinner wall. Probably half of that truck is 065. And, but it's where it counts, and the important stuff is proper. And so there's ways that you can do both. Like I said, competitive and safe. And that's the direction and mindset that I approach this with. And with that said, like, if you want a copy of my rough draft in a PDF format, go ahead and email me. I'll shoot it off to you. Like, I full transparency with all this stuff. Like, I want to hear people's thoughts, questions, concerns. I mean, I already know some people will have questions, concerns on some of the dictation I have in here, and I get that, but I just hope that you would look at this with an open mind and understand that my thought process was not where we're at, but where we can be, and where SCORE can be with creating a standardization that is unrivaled for safety in the off-road motorsports world. That's where I want to go. And so, as always, gentlemen, I appreciate your time, and we'll see where this goes. Maybe they adopt all of this. Maybe they tell me to get fucked. Who knows? Maybe half of it gets adopted. At a minimum, you can deploy all of this in your current build. You can deploy all of this in your fab shop, in your building shop, with you and your buddies drinking beer in the fucking garage, building a UTV or a Class 8 truck, which I really hope some people will bring those fucking things back. Talk about some heavy metals. But, the point being is all of this stuff can be deployed and utilized even if you're not racing SCORE. So you don't have to just be like, oh, well, if I'm not racing SCORE, I'll ignore all this shit. No, fuck that. If you're building a nice luxury piano for you and the family, whatever, these are fundamentals that you can adhere to that will create a more optimized, safe situation for your platform. Again, my name is Jason Elvis Hurd, JH Consulting, Inc., and I appreciate your time. And as always, gentlemen, pitter patter.